Okay, you want to take a look at my shared screen. That's where everything's going to be up on. If you got two monitors, I certainly encourage you to have a web browser open in the second one, so you guys can follow along. All right, first thing first, I'm going to put a link in WotLK. This is something I recommend everyone bookmarks. So it is a direct link to our guild's log calendar. This is the log calendar view, and it always comes up to the current month. And this is the quickest, easiest way to always get at our latest logs. You don't have to know an exact log URL. Just come on here, and if a log's available, it shows up on the day that we ran the raid. So I'm going to be looking at our Oldor log from last Saturday. So at this main section, it breaks down the individual boss encounters. You can also look at all boss encounters. This covers all kills. And you can also look at all encounters and trash fights. And it just records different sets of data. So top DPSers usually vary depending on how well they do with the trash fights versus just the bosses. So what we're going to do is we're going to pick a boss here, and we're just going to go through the elements you want to be aware of. So start up, there's a bunch of tabs and a bunch of different modes, so don't let it throw you off. We'll go through them. We're going to start in Analyze, which is where you start off in default. And then you've got a bunch of different tabs here. So starting with the Summary tab, this just gives an overall summary of the raid. So it parses out who the participants were, and it gives us a section on damage done, and a section on healing done, and a section on damage taken, which is the tanks. And then it has more details of individuals down here at a glance. Next, we're going to go over to the damage done, and this is where most people go. This is the first tab where you can see your parses. So this is the parse column. What a parse is how good was your performance on this particular boss fight compared to other people with the same class and spec as you. So you're being ranked in what percentile of players. So if you're dead center, middle of the road, you're at 50%. If you're one of the elites, you're in the 95 to 100 percentile. The color codes go into stuff. So a gray parse, which I believe is 1 through 20, is just poor performance. A green parse is a below average performance. A blue parse is a above average performance, and then purple is a good performance. Orange is reserved for the 95 through 99 percentile, and then there's a yellow 100 for the absolute top 1% of players. After the parse, the other thing to look at is this is your eye level parse. So it's the same general thing, but it's instead of comparing me to every Frost Death Knight, it's comparing me to every Frost Death Knight within 2 eye levels of myself. Now, if you're doing well, this really doesn't matter, and you can ignore it. If you're not doing well, then looking at this is a quick indicator of, am I being held back by gear or am I being held back by something else? So looking at seed here, we've got a green parse over here, but we've got a purple parse over here. So he is outperforming other Affliction Warlocks at his gear level, and that's a strong indication he's being held back by lesser gear. And we can also look at his eye level, which is 211, and if we look at everyone else's eye level, we can see he's fairly low. Of course, he just recently came back raiding. He hasn't gotten a lot of stuff, so that's what's going on there. So what this tells me is, getting gear to seed and his performance is going to go up without any other changes going on. So again, if you're doing really well, if you're happy with your parse, don't worry about eye level. If you're not happy, look at it and it'll give you an indicator of how much is your issue gear base versus other things. Active, this is how much time you were actively on the boss. Now this fight is razor scale, and the logs tend to ignore the ads. So like it has a note right here that they're excluded. So up until here, there is no activity and everyone's at 0. So we have relatively low active numbers on this particular boss. If we go to Ingus, now we have high active numbers. Higher is better. That's how much time you're on the boss, and it's also a measure of how much time you're actively doing abilities. So actively casting, actively swinging, and doing different things. As a general rule, more time on the boss equals more damage and more DPS. And then, of course, this is the actual DPS number. Initially, these are sorted by DPS, but you can click on any column and resort based on what you want to do. One aspect to keep in mind when looking at parses is time to kill the boss is a big factor. We're not a speedrunning guild, and so the chances of getting everyone into a purple or legendary parse is very small because our kill times are longer than the really high performing guilds. If you go back a couple of weeks and look at Razor Scale, before with this Razor Scale fight, we got him down and we got him to 50%, and then we continued on to the last phase. If you look at our first week, it took us 2 times to get him down to hit 50%, and our parses are absolutely awful. And it's because we took so much longer to kill the boss. So understand that the parsing is partially on your performance, but it's also partially on boss kill times. So if you're constantly comparing yourself to the top 10 players of your spec in the world, you're always going to be disappointed. There's a couple of filters up here. The one to pay attention to is weighted damage. And this changes things a little bit. What weighted damage does is it rewards a player prioritizing the appropriate targets, and it tries to reduce stat padding. So if I'm on a fight where I'm supposed to be focusing on the boss, but there's ads available that's not being counted, if I'm doing the right thing, it's going to reward it a little bit. So this is something you can, again, look at, but we don't really have a lot of people deliberately stat padding around here, so I wouldn't expect most of our fights to have a big change with this enabled. If you mouse over any particular name, you get a quick summary of where their damage was coming from. It gives a percentile, what their 5 strongest abilities were, and how much that accounted for their DPS. If you click on a name, and it changes the filter up here, you can get a more detailed view of that. If you go into summary with a name, you can get a list of gear and current enchants. This is useful if you're kind of comparing yourself to a particular individual and you want to see what some differences might be. The last bit up here is the graph, and it goes through the duration of the fight with healing, damage, and you can kind of see with different events. A red bar like this is usually someone's death. if we go into, yeah, there it is, damage done. So if you want to see yourself on this, we'll pick Vathan. So here's the raid average, and here's Vathan. Now there should be parallels between the two, but what we're seeing from him is he was doing above average performance there, which of course we see with his higher parts here as well. And you can click on as many names as you want, but having just a couple is going to make it easier to see what's going on. And it may be interesting for you to see where your peaks and valleys may be. But the most important things out of here, parse will tell you how you did compared to the rest of the world. Eye level parse will tell you if maybe there's a gear holding you back, and the rest of it's just comparing yourself to the rest of our raid on that one fight. Damage taken is primarily for the tanks. If you're really high on this list, that's not a good thing, and that might be an indicator of a mechanic you need to work on. Healing is essentially the damage done for healers. It gives them their overheal percentile, and it gives them their parse and their active percentile and their heal per second. Heal parses are not nearly as reliable from an external view as DPS parsing is, because a healer can do more things to pad out their numbers. And if you have like a disc healer who's just absolutely dominating because of their shield base, everyone else in that raid is going to be a lower parse. These would probably be blues if Havel wasn't there. But that's just how that goes. So healers, this is something you can look at and you can certainly see about improving yourself, but it's not something I would set personal value on. Um, if you kept everyone alive, you did your job, and that's great. It's same thing with tanks. The parsing and some other information might be useful if you're trying to just fine tune, but at the end of the day, if you stayed alive and no one died because of your inactions, and if the boss died, then who cares? You did your job. Next, we're going to look at buff. And this is just a breakdown of the different buffs that went out and what the various uptime was. So like here's heroism. It's usually way over here in the front, but because we wait till Razor, it's over here. And then debuffs are over here. We have a better way of viewing this stuff in the Google Sheets, which I'll get to in a little bit. Deaths give us information on who died. Two big things that take away from it is what killed you. So is it something you could have avoided? What kind of damage you were taking? And for the healers, were you receiving healing? So if you have a bunch of people dying and there's 0 on the healing, then maybe those deaths were preventable, and it's something the healers can look at. Interrupts and dispels, essentially the same thing. Who's doing what for stopping certain events. Again, our Google Sheets also shows this and a little bit easier to read way. But for raid leads, this is good. For individuals, it's usually not important. Resources I don't really worry about. And casts we will worry about later. So this general graph will go over how many casts. So Super Blue casted 152 abilities. And some of this is going to be limited by class just because of the nature of your things. But we're going to get into this more when we get into a comparison a little bit later on. The other tab I want to focus on up here is rankings. This essentially shows the parsing information again. One thing that shows this as well is it'll show you your rank for this particular fight and then what your best rank has been on this particular fight. So we can say Akalam had this ranking and that was his best to date on the particular fight. You can also see this for yourself you just type in your character name up here, it'll pop up for Pagel, and it'll show you, it defaults to Old Door 25, shows you all your stuff. All right. Oh yeah, what was everything in rankings? There's 2 guild slots here. One's for execution, one's for speed. Speed we're not going to worry about. We're not a speed running guild. Execution is worth noting. Execution is how well you perform the fight and mechanics. So the first thing it does is it looks at your deaths. And if you had any deaths, it's a big knockdown score. So we had 1 death and it really knocked us down. After that, it looks at how much damage was taken by the raid. Obviously, there's X amount of damage that the tanks are going to tank no matter what, but there's a lot of avoidable damage for everyone else. So the lower you do that, the higher execution ranking goes. We don't compare ourselves on this. It's not a big thing, but it's a nice little indicator of how well that we do that particular fight compared to um, other guilds. All right. Next time we'll come back to logs in a minute. The next thing I want to go through is the Google Sheets that we've been posting up. We've been keeping these for a few months at the officer level and wanted to start sharing them for everyone else. So the first one is our week-to-week sheet. All this data is pulled in from the damage done. It's actually it's all this data. It's the damage done for all kill encounters, and we just take out the vehicles and stuff. So this data gets imported in to here each week. So this is all the same. We then we look up the median DPS of every class and spec. The median DPS is as how the DPS that as many people did above as did below. So it's the very center of the DPS range as reported by the logs. We pull it for the last 2 weeks and we pull it for all the older bosses. So we put that in next to everyone. And then we calculate out where everyone is compared to the median. So if you're at 100%, you're at the median. If you're over 100%, then you're over that. You're doing above average. If you're below 100%, then you're below average. And then how much below goes in by the percentage here. I also average it down for the whole raid team. The tanks don't get it because that's just not a thing for them. Over here, I take your last Oldor data from the same spreadsheet and punch it in. It's generally from last week, but if you didn't run last week, I pull the data from your last 25-man run. And then we get a marking on improvement. This was actually the first time we've had not a whole bunch of improvement going on. Super made a change to his spec that he expected to have a big improvement, and guess what it did? If you go to a week prior, this is more typical what we see. I really don't know what was going on last week because all of our kill times were faster, but our DPS was down. I don't know what's going on. I even told the officers to report. I have no clue what's going on here. I'm ignoring it. So typically we do see improvement ranges over here. And this just tells how it's going. So this is something you can look at if you're actively doing something to improve. You can look at this when it comes up, and it gives you a really quick, did I improve or not, snapshot. But keep in mind, this is for all boss fights. So if you're focused on a single boss fight and you just died when you normally don't on some other one, it can impact this. The next 2 sheets are from an outside source. And again, I basically run our log data through these, and it's mostly an automated process and gives us this funnel version. So this one is the combat log analytics. It does a few other things, but this is just all we have it do. So the first tab is gear issues. So it basically points out if someone has a metagem issue or a gemming or enchanting issue. So last week,
Mm,
Nimlavara's metagem wasn't active for the pretty much the entire raid. And I let him know, and he checked. Sometimes it gives a false positive on the metagem, so you always want to double check it. Um, if we see something like this with no enchants, well, these are high eye level, and it's only for a couple bosses. This is brand new gear Boo got, and she just immediately put it on, so we're not worried about that. She was getting enchanted after the raid. If we have someone going a long time without anything, um, then we usually want to follow up on that. Combat buffs is looking at your flasks, your food, and your potions. Since we're usually on top of everyone for food and flasks, that's almost always 100%. For potions, it does a breakdown for pre-potting, and it does a breakdown for potting mid-battle. Healers are always exempt when we look at this because they just mana pot when they need to. We want everyone else in here as much as possible, and then we want them in the pre-potting where applicable for themselves. So, like I pre-pot now as a Frost Death Knight, but I did not pre-pot as an Unholy Death Knight just because of the nature of the class. Um, so again, here if we see anything that looks a little wonky or low, if it's one time, we usually don't worry about it. If we see a pattern, though, it gives us something to check in on. Boss debuffs. These are the debuffs everyone's putting in. We don't have a feral druid, so we're really not getting this one here. One thing that popped up last week is we were having a lower rank of a paladin spell being used. So we let Ty know that. I think he was going to check in with everyone on what was going on with that. But for the most part, everything's fine. And then not really important, but this takes our current log and our last log, and it kind of compares our timestamps with how long it takes to get through a boss and to get through a wing, and how long for the total. So in this case, we're seeing a lot of green, so we were running a little bit faster um, this week than we were the week prior, which is what you want to see. We should always be going a little bit faster. All right, this one is the role performance breakdown. It's from the same source as the other one. This is a lot. This is something more for you guys to dive into individually. So the general tab just shows a few things. It shows potion usage. It shows some defensive. It shows engineering. Just some general data there. For an individual, you want to go into your tab. So casters go into caster, healers into healer, hunters and melee go into physical. And everyone's designated as one or two of these roles, depending on what you're doing. And this gives you a little bit more data set. One thing the officers look at is this is avoidable damage. And anything in orange and red is worth noting. So it tells us what you were getting hit with um, at that particular time. So this is all damage that could be avoided. Avoiding damage puts less stress on the healers. If we can run with less healers or more of the healers can switch over to DPS, it just speeds everything up. So getting rid of the red and orange on an individual level has benefits for the whole raid, even if you didn't die and even if it didn't affect your personal DPS. If you want to compare yourself more directly to someone else in our raid, which isn't always useful. I'm the only Frost DK, and half the time Ravel is tanking, so I can only get so much out of this. But like we have two survival hunters, they can compare themselves. And this goes through what you're doing for every ability versus what they're doing, and includes uptime on certain base components. So if you want to play with this and go through it, if you're not getting a lot out of this, that's fine. Um, it's more of a it's there if it's there. but there's nothing in here that isn't in the logs. It's just shown it to us a bit early. Final tool, I have not started using this. I'm actually going to start using this weekend and testing it out. It's called Wipefest. So you put in your report and you pull up a boss fight. And the two main things it does of interest is it scores the mechanics of the raid, and it does it with the same parsing. So high number and prettier colors are better. So it lets us know where we seem to be doing poorly and what might be going on. Now some of this might be bad data. Um, so usually anytime I see Nimlavara being yelled at about getting hit with something, well, he's usually off tanking. So that's his job. Like our potion use was real strong here. Everyone using, you know, health stones, and then some just different information there. And then there's a similar thing for players. It scores everyone not based on damage, but based on how well you're doing the mechanics. And if you click on yourself, it goes through. So it's fussing at me about taking scorch damage from the front, and I'm being fussed at about taking flame jet damage. Actually, no, there's no flame jet damage. Um, so it's just another tool. I don't think it's going to be our biggest tool by any means. It's just something we're going to be taking a look at. And this is something that anyone can pull up as long as you have the URL of a log you want to take a look at. All right. Are there any questions before I move on? Everyone has a perfect understanding of everything I just said.
Uh-huh.
Okay. Fair enough. All right. So the next part I'm going to get into is a lot more into using this data to improve your own performance in the game. I'm going to be focusing on DPS and damage because that's just what the majority of us do. The same principle applies for healers. You just look at different numbers, and tanks a little less so, but I think both our main tanks are fairly comfortable with what they're doing and figuring stuff out. Um, so doing damage is done when we're using our powerful abilities as often as possible, as fast as possible. More casting equals more damage. More resource generation equals more casting, which equals more damage. The other side part of that is having damage increasing buffs active when you want to use your strongest abilities, and having multiple buffs active and synergized to get the most amount of damage out of your most powerful and resource limited abilities. Similarly, on some boss fights, there are stages where the boss takes more damage, and so it makes sense to line up our big damage at those particular stages just to get more out of them. So with what we're going to do here in a minute, the three really big questions you want to be asking yourself. Are you prioritizing your abilities correctly? Are you using your best abilities as often as possible? And are you using damage increase abilities in tandem with one another to get the most damage out of your abilities? The big example is the opener, which is really important in Classic. As you know, we get heroism going within 10 seconds of a fight in most cases, and that's a massive buff for everyone. You just do everything faster. So if you do nothing special, you get a buff off heroism. But I save my personal buff increases for the same time I'm doing heroism. And then I'm trying to get my biggest abilities going. So my biggest single target ability is Obliterate. And the best way for me to use Obliterate, which is limited by rune usage, is to get as many Obliterates as possible while I have Unbreakable Armor active, which is a buff on a 1 minute cooldown. And ideally, I want to have that buff going. I want my potion going, and I want heroism all going at the same time. And I'm going to be doing the most damage at that point. If you look at a lot of our damage graphs for a lot of our fights, this is the opener, and this is heroism, and this is what happens when it drops off. And everyone should be, unless the fight calls for something else, you should be using your big stuff here. You should be using your cooldowns. You should be using your big abilities here. The other secondary benefit of that is if the ability has a short enough cooldown, like 5 minutes or less, under 5 minutes, there's a chance you can use it again at the end of the fight and get another benefit out of there. So what I'm going to show you now is how to compare yourself to a top performer in a very similar raid scenario as you. And this pulls worldwide. So you don't need to have another Frost DK or Survival Hunter or whatever in your own raid. You can look at some of the better performing players of your class and spec and see what they're doing and see what you're doing. And if they're doing something different, and because they outscored you, you need to go through those questions. Are you using your abilities correctly? Are you using them as often as possible? Are you using your buffs in tandem with everything? And maybe take some tips off of what they're doing and apply that to you. So I'm going to look at Kolangarn because I don't have a great parse here. I didn't die or anything. I'm, top 4 for us, but I'm just, other Death Knights are doing, most other Death Knights are doing better. So I want to know why. So you have to pick a particular fight, and we're going to go to compare. We're going to skip these two, and we'll go down to the search section. So I'm going to select me. You can leave these all as default. What these do is filter the log, and the idea is we want to filter logs that are like us. So again, if I look at the top Kolagar kill of a Frost Death Knight in the world, it's going to be a fast kill. It's going to be a 40-second kill, and that's not what we're doing, and it's not what we're ever going to do. It's not a good comparison for me. So the first thing this does is it's going to be kills within 10 seconds of ours. So they're doing about the same time frame. Make sure they have a raid about the size of ours. You can put this to 0 or just leave it as 2. Almost everyone runs 25, so it doesn't matter. This keeps it on their eye level. So I'm going to look at someone with this very similar eye level as me. So he doesn't have a gear advantage. He may have different items, and that may have an impact. But overall, it's not going to be the only reason they did better than me. And then the default's limit to 28 days. If you want to see something more recent, you can limit it to 14 days. I wouldn't do more than that. Select metric. Damage, you could just leave it as default. It almost always goes. If you're doing this for healing, I would select healing just to make sure it does what you want to do. So I have all that set. I hit search. And it's going to look at every log in the system worldwide within these parameters for this particular boss. Okay. And these are all guys outscoring me. And they give me a percentile of what kind of match they are versus me and give me a couple bits of information. 90% of the time, just screw all that, click the top guy. That's who you want. He's the best. Why compare yourself to the second best? This particular guy is Korean, if I'm reading this script. Oh, or maybe Taiwanese. And that happens. The Asians are really big powerhouses, and that causes a problem for the comparison. So there's a translate button here. I'm going to click that, and now instead of seeing script, I'm going to see the English of their names. Now, one thing I noticed when I was doing this is you may still get a translation difference. Uh, when I was looking at this earlier, Unbreakable Armor, which is what it's called on English logs, it's called Frost Pillar on their logs. And in this comparison, it's going to be called Frost Pillar. So it's just something to kind of keep in mind. If you absolutely don't want to deal with this, then just pick the top guy who has a, you know, English sounding name and go with that. All right. So now we want to do our comparison, and there's a few different things to look at. If you go to summary, so I'm on the left and the other guy's on the right, and kind of take a look at gear. And again, the limit's by eye level, so we have very similar gear. So we both have the same main hand. Um, he's got maybe a slightly better offhand, but it's about the same. I wouldn't worry about the individual gear here too much. The big thing to look at is what are his enchants and what are his gems, and is he doing something significantly different than me? In this particular case, no. We're basically gemming strength. We're doing the same trick to get the same meta going, and he's got almost all the same enchants I do. I think yeah, he's even using the underlay. So,
Bit.
yeah.
I spaced for one hot second, and I'm trying to figure out how you got to the gear.
Summary.
Thank you.
Yeah, when you have an individual selected, summary always takes you to gear.
Thank you.
Okay. So again, this is just something to glance at. Everything looks there's nothing of consequence here. So I'm not going to worry about this now. So it's going to come down to other factors.
I've got a
So
quick
go to
question.
damage done, and we have our abilities side by side, and it's ranking our abilities by amount of damage each one did, the amount of total DPS each one did. At this point, I want to first focus on the top 3 items on each of us. So for me, it's Obliterate, then Melee, then Frost Strike. For him, it's Frost Strike, Howling Blast, and Melee. Ruh-roh, I'm doing something wrong. I'm using Obliterate too much. He is Howling Blasting like a madman. He is Howling Blasting 16 times, which is probably about as much as he could do for the fighting encounter. I did it a whopping 1 time.
Is it multi-target fight?
Yes, this is Kullangar with the left and right arms.
Mm-hmm.
I was saving mine for the ads. He is just blowing his on the boss. Is what's going on here. Another thing I looked at, I'd read up on, and I checked a little later in his cast. It doesn't show up here because no, there it is. Is he had Death and Decay up, and that's something I found out. All Death Knights are supposed to do is first thing you do is drop Death and Decay right in the middle of the boss at the start of the fight. So that's an earth item there. And he's getting a lot of frost strikes off. Now, he's got about 10 more than I do. If I look at my blood strikes, I've got 5. He's got 3. I know I've personally been having an issue where I've been prioritizing blood strike more than frost strike when I should be doing the opposite. So that shows that out. And the most of the rest, we're both using Raised Dead. He's got an extra bomb, but that doesn't really account for much, so I'm not going to worry about that. We're both using Sappers. Um, he used his Icy Touch and his Black Strike once, which meant he kept his disease rolling the whole time. I did too, so I managed to keep my disease rolling the whole time, so that's good. So big initial takeaway is I need the Howling Blast on cooldown and sacrifice Obliterates for that. To get the extra damage out. The next thing I can look at here, and then this graph kind of shows our DPS. And as you can see, for the most part, he was just always outperforming me throughout the entire fight. The next place I want to go is Cass. Again, we ignored this individually, but it's fantastic when you're doing a comparison. And I'm going to uncheck this one item, and we'll get to this in a minute. So this is showing pretty much the same information we were just looking at, but what I could do up here in the chart is select certain abilities and see when he's doing something compared to when I'm doing something. So a big thing is find frost pillar. Or did they change the name? Pillar of Frost, here it is. So Pillar of Frost is unbreakable armor. This is our 1 minute cooldown little buff. It's big for Obliterate, it's big for Frost Strike. We use it very close to our open, and we use it as often as possible. For me to parse, I need to use this as much as possible, and to get as many Howling Blasts or Obliterates in during the short window while it's available. It makes or breaks having a good parse to a great parse. So I'm going to turn this on for me, and I can see when I'm using it in the fight. And I'm going to turn it on for him. Ruh-roh. He's using it way closer to the time frame of the fight start than I am. Now, one other thing I want to look at is my hyper speed accelerator. This is a special glove enchant for engineers. So I'm going to put mine as orange. My orange shows up where my green is because I have those two macroed. If I check him, it's shown up in the same place too. So he has that same macro. Okay, so that's good. So I'm doing that right. So I'm kind of curious what's going on at the start here. I can go into timelines. Push this out. This gives me what I did at what time frame versus what he did at what time frame. This goes through the entire fight. I wouldn't really do that, but this is fantastic for comparing openers because you don't have to go far into it. So he is pre-potting, Icy Touch, Plague Strike, and he's got all four of these abilities on a single macro. His Engineering Gloves, the Unbreakable Armor, and Blood Tap, which is just something we do. And he's also got a racial going for him because he's Horde, the superior species, apparently. So, and then he...
That's interesting.
Yeah, then he's Blood Boiling, and then he's Howling Blasting, and he's getting some Plague Strikes going, and he gets his Sapper going, and then he moves into a little bit more rotation. So I pre-pot, I Icy Touch, I Blood Strike. I don't have these two macros to simultaneously happen. I do them in 2 clicks, and that causes a delay. I've actually fixed this today. And then I started with Obliterates, Pestilence, and went into my normal open, which included using the runic weapon here.
Oh, is that what it's doing? It's calling Blood Boil Pestilence in this case?
Yes. And it's probably because of the translation error on his end.
Gotcha.
On other times I've seen comparison, Pestilence says Pestilence, but it uses the Blood Boil icon because screw you.
Yeah.
That's why. So he's doing some things different. Now, a big thing I see right up front, he is getting his Icy Touch off right here, and I'm getting mine off here, which means he's getting to the boss faster. He's probably using his rocket boots. I don't tend to use my rocket boot to open. I like to save them in case something bad happens. That's probably a bad habit on my part. So I should rocket boot and get in sooner, so I have more uptime on the boss. Given the number of frost strikes he has, he's probably also building up his runic energy ahead of the fight, so he has a banked amount. That's not something I tend to do. And he goes away in before he needs to use runic empower weapon. Now he is death and decaying 16 seconds in, where I was told to do it right at the pull. So that's kind of interesting. So again, there's tidbits I can get out of this. So I fixed this macro. I'm going to rocket boot in, and I'm going to use Howling Blast on cooldown. And there's other things he's doing differently, but if I just take those 3 things, I should see an increase in my parse. And then if I'm not happy with that increase, I can do this again next week, see if it's him or someone else that's the top guy, and do more comparisons of what's going on. The last thing I want to show you guys, and this is more of a tool that maybe a raid leader uses. You can look at it if you like, you're kind of want to figure out what's going on with death. But if nothing else, it's just a neat ass little tool. So I'm gonna turn off the comparison, and that's this replay. And for some reason, it's scrunched on mine. I don't know why. So replay takes our log and it replays our fight in real time. So we can see who's doing what. When deaths come up, it'll mark someone as dead, and we can kind of see everyone's positioning throughout the fight. I can filter it out so I can eliminate people so there's less icons to deal with. So there's the ads popping up. There's Nim taking the ads away. There's one ad beelining for someone. So again, this is more of a leader tool, but maybe it's one of those, like I had a death on Thorum last week, and when I checked, it was because of the chain lightning. So I pulled this up, and I saw I was a lot closer to Ty, who also died to chain lightning, than all the other melee were. So I figured maybe that was a problem. There may have been something else going on, but it was something where I can see a visual indicator of that without having to actually remember the fight. So that's it. That's how you can read. So you can look at your parse to see if you're in a good place or not. There's other data available if you want to nitpick what particular thing maybe happened to you on any particular fight or event. But if you're looking at checking yourself, the compare tool cannot be beat because it gets you outside of our raids and our raid team and looking at other people in the world. But it's not an unrealistic viewing of people. It's people with similar kill times, similar gear. And that just shows, so at that point, the only difference between them and you is the player, and the player's actions are going to be the most meaningful things. And that's what you can look at and see if there's lessons you can take and apply to yourself. All that said, you may see something and interpret a certain way, and it may not quite be accurate like that. So, if you try something and it doesn't perform well, it's something to keep in mind. Sometimes other people do other things because their group behaves differently or has different tactics than we do, and that's fine. But you want to do what's works best for you within the confines of our raid, not what's works best on the world stage necessarily. Anytime.
Thank you so much, Bit. This is really helpful.
Awesome. And anytime you guys have questions, if you're seeing something and you're not sure you're reading it right, or you got questions about something in particular, ask. Let us know. Several of us know how to do this. All the officers are willing to help out. So you can send a DM to me. You can post something into Discord, and we'll be happy to take a look and see what you're seeing. Any other questions? All right.
No,
well,
but also thank you.
Thanks for coming for my TED Talk.